Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Justinian and Theodora Part 2, The Reforms of Justinian by Extra History. Now in Part 1, we got a bit of a background on the history of the Eastern Roman Empire and the reign of Justinian's predecessor, his uncle Justin. We ended last time with Justinian finally stepping up to take the throne. Now, before we get into this episode, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Last time, we saw the Emperor Justin rise from a peasant pig farmer with a little help from his nephew Justinian. Today, we'll see what happens when power changes hands and Justinian becomes sole ruler of Rome.
You know, succession was a big problem in the Roman Empire, and really is a big problem in a lot of monarchical type systems. There are a lot of good and even great emperors who had pretty bad successors. You know, Marcus Aurelius is a pretty famous example. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, is another great example. Now, it's not always about choosing a bad successor. Obviously, luck comes into play. I think Augustus is a good example. He tried his hardest to find an appropriate successor, but was really foiled by bad luck and misfortune every step he took. So I think Augustus actually tried and got unlucky. There are a lot of good emperors, though, who don't really think that much about succession. You know, a lot of these sort of great figures of history are very self-centered, they're very ambitious, they feel they're the only person who can do the job, and if you've achieved that much, maybe that's fair enough, but that can often lead them to forget that one day they're going to be dead and gone, and they need someone else. Now, Justin, not like Justin is an all-time emperor, but he was a good emperor. And obviously, luck still comes into play. He was lucky to have a nephew like Justinian, but you gotta give some credit to Justin too. He didn't push Justinian out because he was afraid, right? People sometimes can get scared if you've got an ambitious family member. You know, he brought him in, he educated him, he brought him through the ranks, he mentored him, he really prepared him for the position. So hey, there you go, Justin was a good, solid emperor, and he managed to shepherd Justinian into the role as well.
Turns out, a lot happens. Upon coming into his own, Justinian bursts into a flurry of action, nearly unparalleled in history. He reformed almost every aspect of the empire, trying to fix 1,000 years of bureaucracy and neglect.
I mean, as the title of this video suggests, Justinian was quite a reformer, and at this point, the bureaucracy of the empire was struggling a little bit. You know, Roman bureaucracy, it had its ups and downs. You know, there were successful emperors who imposed more successful bureaucracy, but, you know, at this point, the Roman Empire has been through, frankly, hundreds of years of warfare and chaos and civil war and infighting and the empire breaking up and joining back together and breaking up and the West falling. So it's not really surprising that the bureaucracy, you know, it needs to be revamped a little bit. More than a little bit, and Justinian is here to do just that.
But he didn't do it alone. He elevated a cast of some of the most talented, most diligent men in the history of the empire to attack all the things he saw wrong with the Imperium. Unfortunately, these brilliant, hard-working servants of the empire were also some of the most corrupt, quirky, and colorful characters the empire would ever see. So today, we're just going to work through Justinian's reforms by introducing you to these characters and what they did. First off, Justinian was a big spender. He wanted to build up the military, increase infrastructure, create monumental public works, and throw lavish games. But to do all this, he needed coin. And one of the problems the Roman Empire struggled with from its inception, one of the problems that helped bring down the West and had almost brought down the East, was tax collection. The rich would avoid their taxes, and the poor couldn't pay. And this just would not fly for Justinian. So he brought in John the Cappadocian.
Yeah, tax collection and inflation over time. The Romans had a lot of serious monetary and fiscal issues, as we, call them today. And a lot of those really contributed to the sort of collapse of the empire's stability over time, especially the debasing of currency, aka inflation, essentially. That was really, really bad for the empire over a long period of time.
I mean, he even sounds like a mobster, doesn't he? This guy, John the Cappadocian, totally overhauled the tax system in the empire. He moved tax collection out of the hands of local officials. He crushed corruption within the ranks of the tax collectors, and one of his less popular reforms, at least with some segments of society, was torturing rich people until they paid their taxes.
God damn.
Of course, he was also a debauched glutton who skimmed from the taxes to feed his own perversions.
Yeah, John, he might have, tamped down on corruption elsewhere, but he was a corrupt individual himself. This is obviously not good, but I feel like I don't have to tell you that it also was not uncommon. I mean, throughout, even now, there's lots of corruption, but especially in a system like this that has so much nepotism and favoritism, you have a lot of control over your network, and it's pretty easy to skim off the top, be corrupt, and so a lot of people did. Many times it was almost a bit of an expectation of the position. Like, I get this position, it's sort of expected that I'll take a bit of that moolah for myself. Now, if it gets too much, that might be a problem. And occasionally you would have a sort of real anti-corruption crusader. And as we saw, you can be both at once. But this was, not super uncommon, right?
Reports abound of his greed, his sexual appetite, and his boorish, slave-like treatment of his staff. Now, of course, many of these are exaggerations. After all, nobody likes the tax man, and being a more efficient tax collector probably isn't going to win you a glorious place in contemporary histories.
Right, it's worth remembering where we get our sources from for a lot of history, but, a lot of history has been written by elites, because up until very recently, they were the only people who could even read and write. You in a lot of societies, you had a small percentage of people who were literate. And then even among them, it's only the people who have the resources, knowledge, connections, and time who have been able to write history. I mean, even now, you want to go do academia? That's hard to get into, and if you don't have money to support yourself, that's pretty difficult. So maybe some of these trends continue. But especially before the modern era, all this history is going to be written, almost all, is going to be written by elites. If we're talking about the sort of written primary source histories that we have. And so you got to remember, we get a lot of this from their perspective. And if you have a guy who is torturing rich people to pay their taxes, they're probably not going to give him a favorable depiction. Plus, people like a story, a good story, a narrative. They like to exaggerate. Especially some of these ancient historians, or we're sort of heading out of antiquity into the Middle Ages now, but they definitely like to exaggerate. So a lot of the more lurid details of history either were rumors or completely made up, or some sort of word of mouth that we really do not have confirmation for.
But there are enough of these reports that I think we can assume this guy was likely running a very whistle-clean tax administration while shaking people down and engaging in some Baron Harkonnen-like good times himself.
Yeah, well, it's, this is why you got to do some historical analysis on your sources. You have to be smart about it. You can't take everything your primary sources say at face value. But if you have a couple of primary sources that corroborate each other on some of these stories, even if the stories themselves may be hearsay, there's probably some degree of truth there, especially if you can pull on other evidence. So it's like, alright, some of these stories are probably exaggerated, but the grain of truth is that, John, he did an effective tax collection operation, but he was massively corrupt and debauched himself. We can probably say that to be true, even if we don't know the extent.
The money he needed taken well care of, Justinian also attacked the second problem of the empire, the legal code. For 1,000 years, laws had been added, changed, and overturned without anybody really collating them, rationalizing them, or really putting them together in any way that wasn't contradictory. At this point, a lot of them just plain didn't make sense. This meant that the law courts had become clogged, corruption was rampant, and justice through the legal system was simply not available for most people. Justinian planned to end this, and so he brought in Tribonian. Tribonian was one of the most brilliant legal minds of all time. In 14 months, he untangled a
we're gonna see what Tribonian and Justinian managed to accomplish here, but you gotta give props to both. And we'll talk about Tribonian here in particular. Clearly a brilliant legal mind who put a lot of effort into this endeavor, because it will be massively, massively influential, but we'll get to that.
Millennium of Roman law and had a new law code ready to publish. Then he compressed 1,500 existing books of legal decisions down to a mere 50-book set, making the law comprehensible and approachable. With Justinian's help, he then had these books ruled to supersede all previous legal decisions, so that all lawyers and judges were working from the same law. He rounded out these mind-boggling feats by writing an accessible textbook for all future lawyers to learn from, and together, these books form the Corpus Juris Civilis, the work that today's civil law is founded on.
Yeah, and one thing I will say is, by the way, if you want to increase your own control and power over the system, what's a better way to do that than to write the laws? You know what I mean? Change the legal system. Napoleon explicitly said this with his Napoleonic Code. He recognized the power of the law, and if you are also someone who recognizes that, then you can have a lot of sort of behind-the-scenes influence. A lot of this civil law, it's not necessarily flashy, it can get really in the details, but it provides you a lot of power over daily life. And so it did that, but also this was massively influential, far beyond Justinian. Like they said, this is the basis for, civil law, like, around the world. We're talking about a world-changing legal innovation. On this channel, we do a lot of Napoleonic history. I just brought them up, but, this is the Napoleonic Code is a bit of a modern equivalent. Think of how influential that was. It's only been about 200 years since that. We're talking, roughly 1,500-ish years. This has been so incredibly influential. In fact, well, it's hard to say what was the most influential thing Justinian did. I don't know if that's even a useful debate, and it's impossible to quantify, but I'd be willing to say it might be the legal code. In terms of the long scale of history, if we go beyond just his time on the throne, I think his legal code is probably the most important and influential thing he achieved.
Of course, Tribonian was also an unabashed pagan, throwing sacrilegious parties and feasts even as Justinian was ostensibly cracking down on paganism. He was also utterly corrupt, or as one author once put it, every day he repeated...
Yeah, Rome is pretty Christian at this point, is very Christian actually, but you'll get this sort of occasional pagan in a high place of power. But yeah, it's definitely not. It's got to be kept at least a little bit under the wraps.
Or enacted some law at the instance of people who purchased this from him. Otherwise, of course, he was known for being good-natured, diplomatic, and only a little bit of a fop. With the Herculean task of reforming the entire canon of Roman law safely in the hands of perhaps the only man in history who might actually be up to the challenge, Justinian could finally turn his eye on military affairs.
Here he comes.
Justinian dreamed of reconquering the West, of reuniting and recreating an empire that had only fallen some 50 years before. He dreamed of restoring Rome. But at the time, the Romans were being kicked around.
And by the way, keep that in mind. It's not like the unified Roman Empire was some distant legend at this point. It was, well, first of all, in recent memory, and also still on paper a real thing. I mean, at this point, the Eastern Roman Empire claimed dominion over the entirety of Roman territory. Now, of course, in practice, that isn't what was happening. In fact, a lot of this territory had been gone for a lot longer than 50 years, right? As we know, when Rome started to crumble, it started to lose those provincial territories. But this is a time when people remember, at least when some of that territory was under Roman control, and the Eastern Emperor still claims control over that territory. So, we talk about Justinian reclaiming the territory of the West, and it certainly was this grand, ambitious plan that, would not happen again. This was sort of the height, at least of this era of Eastern Roman history after the breakup of the empire. But it wasn't, it was pretty crazy, but it wasn't too impossible a thought. Eastern Rome still claimed the territory. Of course they'd want to take it back. It's just that no one else managed to do so to the same extent as Justinian.
By the Sassanid Persians all across the southern half of the empire. Before Justinian could turn his eye west, he had to stop the Persians from taking over what empire there was left. And for this, he had one of the best generals history has ever produced.
Yep.
A man easily the rival of Napoleon or Alexander, though his name's not so well known. A man named Belisarius.
I will say, here on this channel, we've done an entire series on Belisarius, reacting to Epic History's fantastic videos on him, though at this point it must be like 2 years ago. I'll leave the link down below if you want to see it, but, you know, we're big Belisarius enjoyers here. He is a very, very capable general.
From an early age, Justinian recognized this man's brilliance, and by the time Belisarius was 25, he was Magister Militum, or theater commander of the East. But to talk about Belisarius, we have to talk about the Battle of Dara. At this point, Roman armies had suffered defeat after defeat at the hands of the Persians. The situation looked hopeless. Belisarius had been ordered to gather together whatever troops he can and hold the town of Dara, a small fortress town that guarded the entrance to Anatolia. If the Sassanid army got past there, they'd be in the heart of the empire. Envoys were sent from the imperial court to sue for peace, but the Persian king would have none of it. His army moved toward Dara. Reports start coming in of the strength of the Persian army. 50,000 men. 50,000. Belisarius looked to his troops, standing on the walls of his desert border fort. 25,000 men. Belisarius wanted to hole up.
And as they basically said, this is where Belisarius is really starting to build his name, build his reputation.
To fight from behind these walls. It was the only way they'd have a chance against an army twice their size. But he knew that if he did that, the Persians would just go around him. Behind him was nothing but farmers in their fields and priests in their churches. No, he had to stop them here, so he prepared to fight.
And you'll see this a lot from Belisarius, as he is really dedicated to protecting the people who live in Roman territory. And, like, genuinely. Now, why did he want to do that? I'm not saying that his motivations were, you know, purely good, right? I mean, this is also, you know, you want to protect your people so they'll support you and send you taxes and etc., etc. I'm not naive about any of that. But if you look at Belisarius, this was someone who really was not willing to sort of allow the enemy to burn more Roman territory in order to get a leg up. He would stand against the enemy to protect Roman territory, even if it didn't put him in the most advantageous position. This is something, once again, we saw this in the series we did on Belisarius, that would come up time and time again throughout his career. And when he conquered new territory, he very much would conquer the territory, but he would also reach out to the people who lived there. Tell them, look, we're not going to pillage, we're not going to raid, we're going to treat you as Roman civilians, Roman citizens, because that's what you are. Not to say his men never, you know, pillaged or raided, no one has complete control over their men, but Belisarius, you know, he maintained a tight hand over that stuff. And he really did pull a bit of a hearts and minds campaign wherever he went, appealing to the regular people. So this is a common theme that we already see here.
A messenger galloped up from the Persians and handed him a note. It was from the enemy commander. It said, "Prepare me a bath, for tomorrow I shall bathe in this fortress." Belisarius ordered his men to dig. The next day, the armies lined up for battle. The massive Persian army with their infantry in the center and the famed immortals on the wings. The Byzantine army lined up across from it, with their infantry anchoring the center behind a great trench they had dug on Belisarius' command, with heavy cavalry on the wings, lighter cavalry in reserve, and a small force of Huns hidden behind a hill. The Persian cavalry charged. The wings were a whirling melee of horses and men. But the center, the infantry holding the Byzantine center, just stood there behind their trench. The Persian commander faltered. Even with his numbers, he didn't want to charge his infantry over that trench. His cavalry were doing well. He would let them win the day. Once they'd routed the Roman cavalry, they could circle behind the infantry and negate Belisarius' improvised defense. And like that, the Persians pinned their own infantry, giving up their massive advantage in numbers. Then, just as the cavalry melee was...
Smart from Belisarius. You know, he's in a very disadvantageous position. He knows he needs to switch things around, right? Any good military commander knows that you need to go into battle with the most advantages you can muster. He was badly outnumbered in a defensive position, so he used that to his advantage, dug a trench, another defense, that would mitigate the enemy's advantage, right? Their massive numerical advantage. I'm saying advantage a lot, but you get my point, right? This is how you gotta really shape the battlefield, the conditions upon which you encounter the enemy in order to win a battle like this.
Was swinging toward the Persians, the Huns sprang from their hiding place. All of a sudden, the Persians' right flank was in disarray. They were falling back. But no matter, there was still time to rally them. The left flank was still doing well. They'd pushed the Romans beyond the trench line. They were pursuing the Roman cavalry almost to the walls of Dara itself. But the rest of the Persian army was still where it had begun. There was a huge gap between the immortals who had chased the Byzantine cataphracts and the infantry that had never moved. The Persian cavalry had chased the Byzantines so far that they were now behind enemy lines, and their infantry was way too far away to support them.
See, and I don't know what in particular went wrong here for the Persians, but this is why you need very strongly disciplined cavalry, right? Because the cavalry, they'll engage the enemy cavalry, but often their goal, especially in this kind of warfare, is to wheel around and attack the enemy infantry, right? So you can essentially encircle or flank them. And that's how you win a battle during this era, and a lot of eras, right? But it's very difficult if you're a cavalry and you're charging your enemy to stop charging, turn around, and go in the other direction. The momentum is to keep moving forward, especially if you keep pushing the enemy cavalry back. It takes an immense amount of organization and discipline to actually get them to wheel back around. Now, like I said, I don't know what in particular happened here, what the problem was, but this is just a good reminder that it is actually tough to pull off that maneuver, which I think sort of seems kind of simple. Oh, yeah, you push forward, you wheel around. It's more complicated than that, or at least more difficult than that.
The Roman cavalry reserve charged. The main Byzantine cavalry rallied. The immortals were surrounded, cut off. Discipline fell apart. Each man tried to hew his way out, but one by one they fell. And now the Byzantines, having the only cavalry left on the field, knew it was their turn to ride the Persians down. No Sassanid commander would be bathing in Dara that day. This victory paved the way for peace in the east. The empire would still have to pay dearly for it, 11,000 pounds of gold, but now the southeastern border could be secured, and just...
Well, that peace in the east would never last. We're talking about the eternal rivalry between the Romans and the Persians. A rivalry that would last, as both empires changed over time. We're talking about the Sassanid Persians at this point. There have been multiple different empires. We're dealing with the Eastern Roman Empire. It's not the unified Roman Empire it once was. This was honestly a rivalry that survived the fall of many dynasties, the fall of, full empires, essentially, and it kept on going, of course, until the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, which destroyed the Sassanid Persians. But until then, this rivalry will continue.
Justinian could turn to the west. Now, following our pattern, this is where you might expect me to tell you of Belisarius' flaws, but by all accounts, he was a stand-up guy.
Yeah, he's a bit of an exception to the theme of, well, these guys did a lot of good, or at least were very competent, but they had their vices. Belisarius apparently was a pretty stand-up guy.
So instead, I'm going to tell you about a historian who was Belisarius' legal advisor and came on all of his campaigns.
Procopius.
A fellow named Procopius. Procopius is our principal source for Justinian's reign. By being with Belisarius...
And once again, this is where you got to think about your sources. When you're getting almost all your information from one guy, first of all, it makes corroboration very difficult because we're dealing with few sources. This is something that characterizes a lot of ancient history. I respect ancient historians, or I should say, those who do ancient history a lot, because I could not do that, man. The lack of sources at certain points is very challenging. So you got to take a lot with a grain of salt, because this is all coming from Procopius's perspective, and he certainly had a perspective. And there's a little more to the sort of historiography of Procopius, some things behind the scenes that we might talk about at some point that does complicate things a little bit.
He had a front row seat to almost every major event. His work is thorough and comprehensive. It's a historian's dream. Thanks to him, the reign of Justinian is...
And sure, there's a lot of value there. I mean, it is almost exactly what you'd want. Procopius was thorough. He was there at many of these events. He knew a lot of the people, and he was literally present. That makes for great primary sources, but, we always got to keep that perspective in mind, keep the bias in mind, and we got to at least try to work around that.
Perhaps one of the best documented periods in Byzantine history. But, and here's where it gets wild, In the 1600s,
Oh, wow.
in an
We're getting to it now.
archive in the Vatican Library, there was found a book, a hidden secret book, called The Secret History, also by Procopius. And while Procopius's official histories paint the reign of Justinian as glorious with a handful of failings mixed in, his secret history talks of Justinian as a monster. And I don't mean like a figurative monster. I mean a demonic creature that could pop off its head and wander the palace headless late at night. It depicts Theodora as debauched and depraved, and spares no one in Justinian's inner circle. Now, today, most historians see Procopius's principal histories as highly valuable, and regard the secret history as little more than slander from some noble who was angered by the way Justinian eroded the power of the nobility. But where else will you find a secret history hidden away for centuries, penned by the same guy who served as the glowing chronicler of the reign?
Yeah, there's a lot of different perspectives on this, and this is not my era of history, so I can't even really get into the historiography. Like, I'm sure... I don't even know what the most up-to-date theories are or what the debates are about this, but it seems to me... I mean, first of all, some of it you actually can't take literally, because it's impossible. But even the sort of the gist of it, right, this very negative take on the people involved, I think it's... You know, so I think some people have argued that it might have been satire, you know, a bit of a joke going around the circles at the time, making fun of those in power. I think it could have been that. I think they mentioned it might just be the sort of bitter writings of a man upset about what had happened. I think, you know, also, a lot of these people involved in power, a lot of them were very competent, but that doesn't mean that they were good people, you know, especially behind the scenes. They might have been nasty and cruel and barbaric and etc., etc. I mean, we see, if we're talking about Justinian, in his actions, his political actions, he was willing to commit pretty heinous acts to get what he wanted. So it's like, yeah, it might be true that a lot of these people were horrible behind the scenes. I don't know how much value that brings to us, but... Yeah, so I don't know. I really don't know what my opinion is on this. I'm not an expert. You'd have to read about it to find out. My guess is that it's like some mix of something a little satirical with maybe a little sort of bitter writing about the people involved. I don't know.
With demons and monsters and the most slanderous critique, nothing in the reign of Justinian and Theodora was done small. Sorry we didn't quite get to talking about the Demes like I promised last time, but there's just so much going on within the first few years of Justinian's reign. Don't you worry though, next time, prepare to witness the Demes' full fury in the Nika Revolt.
Oh yeah. That is quite a moment in Justinian's career. I won't talk about it now, because we'll talk about it next time. Alright, another good episode of this series. We learned essentially about Justinian's crew, and some of the reforms he was pursuing. Once again, I said this last time, I'm not going to make the argument they should have included more, because this is actually quite a long series, but just know that very little was covered here of all of the sort of political achievements of the Justinian regime. There were so many more changes and reforms made. I mean, this is why there's so much content, so many books. You could read a lot on Justinian alone, so there's a whole lot more here that didn't get covered for the sake of simplicity. But yeah, thought this was a good episode. We got to talk about our boy Belisarius. We'll see more of him throughout this series. He plays a pretty big role in the reign of Justinian. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.